one of my main areas of focus was parent states of mind. And what that means is you can dive into the mind of you as a parent with something called the Adult Attachment Interview. And with the most robust power over anything else, even someone watching you at home for a year, we can predict how your child will be attached to you, whether it's securely or non-securely. And that security of attachment of your child essentially predicts all sorts of things like your child's emotional resilience, their capacity for mutually rewarding relationships with others. We call it an attachment stance or attachment strategy. And security is what you want to aim for as best you can. The great news from this field of attachment research, which I'm trained in, is that it isn't what happened to you that will determine if your child is securely attached to you. It's how you've made sense of what happened to you. And the importance of that finding cannot be overstated. In other words, people sometimes come to me and say, oh, terrible things happened to me in my childhood and I'll never get over it. I'll never be a good parent. I'll go, wait a second. The research shows that I know you're concerned about that, but if you can make sense of your childhood experiences and how they affected you, you can liberate yourself from perpetrating that which was done to you onto your kids. So that I wrote up in a book with my daughter's preschool director, Mary Hartzell, called Parenting from the Inside Out. And once I wrote that book, which starts with the science of attachment, and now we'll talk about the S's, I could write all the other 5 or 6 or whatever parenting books I've written, where I always say, start with parenting from the inside out, because that's what the research shows. Make sense of your own childhood experiences first, and then figure out, what do I do with my kids?
Yeah, ain't that the truth?
When that book was first coming out, one of my first teachers was Barry Brazelton, a pediatrician back a while ago. He passed away recently. And, when I said to Barry, when should we give this to parents? He said, right away, even when they're pregnant. And I'm not sure pregnancy is the best time, but definitely
before pregnancy.
Yeah, you want to read it. So that being said, as an educator and as a therapist for families, what I needed to do is take this entire field of attachment and make it really understandable, not just for the academics I was working with, but for parents. So basically, my summary of the entire field of attachment comes down to 4 S's, and here they are. When you get the first 3 S's, and if you don't get them, any of them, the parent recognizes there's a rupture, there's a disconnection, and readily and reliably makes a repair. So there's no such thing as perfect parenting. There's only showing up and being present as a parent with good intention and being aware, being mindful. So I say that because people freak out and go, oh my, I haven't been doing it. If you haven't been doing it, fine. Now you can make a repair. It's never too late to make a repair. So that's the important place to start. And if you can, be kind to your inner experience, because we're all coming through a hard road.
Yeah.
And parenting is one of the hardest things to do in general, and these days especially. So the first S is the word seen, S-E-E-N. And when a child feels seen, it isn't just that you're using your eyes to see their behavior. It means you're using what I call a mind-sight lens to see their feelings, what has meaning for them, what was their intention, what were they remembering. The inner nature of their mental lives is what I mean by the word seen. And it's very clear from the research, parents who take the time and develop the skills, because they're learnable skills, to see the inner life of the child, have children who develop secure attachment.
Okay.
Second S, soothed. What this means is your child could be distressed. They've gone through what I call a window of tolerance. They're in chaos. They're in rigidity. They're shut down. Those moments, they're not in this kind of integrated flow. And at that moment, you yourself, because of a set of neurons in you called mirror neurons, which should have been called, I think, sponge neurons, you sponge in your kid's distress. So their distress may make you distressed. So if you don't have your presence there where you're receptive, you may become reactive even as they become reactive, which just amplifies all the reactivity. So soothing your child is more than, let me just, try to put a Band-Aid on their wound. It's really giving them the comfort that allows them to see that I, as your son, can be as distressed as I can be and you don't leave me. You stay present with me. You're able to hold a space for my distress. And in that connection you establish, my nervous system, which is immature, is able to calm down, and that's what we mean by soothing. And don't forget, there's no such thing as perfect parenting. You may not see your child all the time. We don't soothe them all the time. But to be able to do that and say, wow, that pushed my hot button. I was having a hard time when you were screaming and yelling like that. Let me try to come back and soothe you. I'm so sorry I couldn't do it then. You can make a repair. And the third S, before the fourth of security, the third S is safe. So safe, of course, is keeping your child protected from injury, but it's also not being a source of emotional fear where, and I say this in all my books, there are times when, I would flip my lid and start screaming or say ridiculous things or whatever, and I would terrify my kids. I had to make a repair after that. Kids are meant to be kept safe by their attachment figures, their parents. And if we have unresolved trauma or unresolved loss, the research is very clear, we're more prone to doing things that we don't even want to do, that are unintentional, that terrify our kids. And even when we alter our own state because we're flipping out, that can be terrifying. If we get drunk, that can be terrifying. We're yelling at our spouse, that can be terrifying. And the other ones that are obvious, like abuse, neglect. So there's a wide range of what creates non-safety. And I don't mean a kid wants ice cream before dinner, you say no, and they go, you make me mad, no, you don't. This is not about just giving them everything they want. It's about not terrorizing them. Setting limits is extremely important for kids. When they have this and when they're not there, there's a repair made when there's a rupture in a reliable and relatively rapid way. Then a child develops security, which is this sense of wholeness, this sense of resilience, this sense of I can do this. And, we're still on a life of, do or die, in this world outside the womb. So no matter how great our parenting is, life is still hard. But security of attachment gives the best kind of resilience that we can give our kids. And the great news is that if you've had a really hard childhood yourself, dive into parenting from the inside out. Mary and I wrote that to be a big hug. And it's a guide to saying, how do I actually make sense of my life? Do that book. It's a workbook, basically. And the great news is, and this is, I was trained as a narrative scientist, when our narrative process literally makes sense in the two ways that we mean it. Makes sense meaning what's the logical way my childhood affected me, but makes sense as in I sense my body. I feel these things. You're able to integrate memory into things that were terrifying before, and you integrate it and you make sense of your life. And that's how you come to allow your personality to relax and stop being a prison and become more like a playground. It allows you to be more receptive with kind intention. So intention for sure that's kind. And that's how we want to bring our presence to our kids.
And I love that, Dan. I mean, you just set the stage for a second conversation at some point in the future, because I'd love to dive into parenting, but I think that's really helpful. You want to help your kids feel seen, soothed, safe. And when you can do that, they will also feel secure. If we look out across the world today, there appears to be a lot of unhappiness, a lot of struggle, and a lot of division. Based upon what you know about human beings and our inner worlds, why do you think there's so much struggle in the world? And are you optimistic about the future?
I think there's an incredible potential that we as a human family have with awareness to make intentional choices that are different from what we do on automatic. And so that's why I actually have a deep sense of hope, a realistic hope, an active hope that is based on scientific reasoning and based on clinical practice and just being a human thinking about where have we gotten ourselves, that I'm very much optimistic. And the reason even, I think, to dive deeply into your important question of why is because if we can figure out accurately what the truth of why is, then we can figure out how to work with that why in a very productive and effective way. So here's what I think is going on. If you go back in time and you basically look at what has happened with our human species, how we've evolved in modern times, we became, number one, mammals, so we became very social. Number two, we became humans, which our formal name is Homo sapiens sapiens. The sapere is the word for the knowing. Mm-hmm. So not only do we know, which is where the hope lies. Because we can actually take this capacity for awareness, for self-awareness, and awaken ourselves from automatic pilot. But what is the automatic pilot we've gotten into? When you follow human evolution, one way to understand it is that we survived based on in-group versus out-group distinctions. So we said, if you're in my cave, you're my family, you're my friends, we're going to protect each other, we're going to cooperate, collaborate, we're going to get some creative unions that are allowing us to not only survive, but we thrive. That's beautiful. We're an incredibly collaborative species. But if we deem that you're in cave B, not the cave A members where we live, and there's the cave B members, if we can discern that these are not us, we can keep them away and they won't threaten us. We can keep our stuff once we start accumulating stuff. And in this distinction, then we could keep the outsiders out, the insiders in. And if we needed to, unfortunately, we could shut off our circuitry of empathy and compassion that we're using for the in-group, shut it off, and sometimes injure, if not kill, the out-group.
Yeah.
And that's basically human evolution in the shortest version you'll ever hear. But if you now expand the population where there's an experience of insufficiency, where people are wanting to own land, own things, and you have modern culture, unlike land-based indigenous cultures that teach the relationship of you as a human to the land is essential.
Yeah.
The relationship of you to generations that came before, your ancestors, and generations that are coming in the future, the descendants, they're all a part of who you are. There's an expanded definition of yourself. That larger self connected to all people and to all of nature starts to become very narrowed down into what you can call a solo self. This isolated, separate solo self in indigenous teachings is something to be watching out for. That is, they say, be careful of the vulnerability of thinking you're a separate self. But in modern culture, we take that word self and we equate it with the individual.
Yeah.
And if you, like me, grew up in a modern culture, you'd say, of course, self means an individual. But if self is really looked at as a center of experience, it doesn't mean it has to be your skin encased body. It could be your relationships with your family, with your friends, with all of humanity, and even all of nature. So we have a relational self and we have an inner self. Sure, you have a body. So I think what's happened is this inner self being equated with the only self that matters, even if it's about a plural inner self, like just my family or people who are like me, my similar race or nationality or religion, all the ways we divide ourselves up. That's created this separation of people from each other that leads to genocides, wars, continual fighting, social injustice, and racism. And it even has us differentiate ourselves from other species. Yeah. So if we're building a factory to get more stuff for our in-group, we don't care if we destroy the environment around the factory because we're building the stuff to get the money that we want. And so we start destroying Earth. And this is what I think is happening. This solo self-view has been, I think, a source of all the pandemics we face, not just causes for the viral pandemic, but these assaults on climate and assaults on our humanity.
I really appreciate those answers. You know, in your first response to my question about optimism and the state of the world, I really felt that there's almost two choices we can make as humans. We can either be intentional about our lives and create the lives that we want, or we can be reactive. And so, you know, I've been absorbed in your previous book, Interconnected, for the last few weeks, which I've really enjoyed reading.
Thank you.
And I sort of think a lot about, like, who are we really as humans? Because as you say about in-group and out-group, it's fascinating because it seems to be, certainly the online world at least, seems to really drive people into choosing their tribe. Who actually are we? Can we transcend some of our base level patterns of trying to other people? So if you don't mind, I just want to read a phrase that you wrote in your book. The world is not always kind, not always compassionate, not always integrative. Our human history of survival-based evolution leads us towards tribalism, and adding to this tendency is our genetically inherited, neurally mediated, socially reinforced propensity towards in-group and out-group evaluation.
Yeah.
So, first of all, I think there's a beautiful bit of writing there.
Thank you.
But, who are we? Like, at our core, who are we? Are we this reactive species who's just trying to protect what's ours and make sure that we're okay and the people around us are okay? Or are we this more loving, compassionate species who wants to thrive, but as I thrive, everyone around me also thrives as well?
Yeah, beautiful. Well, thank you for pointing out that passage. And that was a challenging and incredibly, powerful experience to write that book, to try to articulate, coming from a culture of individualism, why I thought individualism was actually the splinter in the soul of the modern psyche that was making us limp forward in life. So the optimism I feel is embedded in that not only passage you wrote, but your response to it, which is that, yeah, I do think with intentionality, with an awakening of the mind to the lie that it's been told, which is that the center of experience that we use the word self to indicate, when that is being told to us as being the individual, that's a lie. Of course, you want the center of experience to be something you put energy into, take care of it, protect it, nurture it, allow it to thrive. Absolutely. And here's the strange thing. If self is thought of as an identical term, a synonym for individual, we are sunk. So the reason I spent all those years writing that book, Interconnected, was a plea to our fellow human beings to say, why can't we wake up to the possibility that modern culture has been a case of mistaken identity, that by telling you, okay, Rangan, who you are is you are just that body you're in, or Dan, I'm just this body. And then do what you can to make sure you're keeping the body healthy and happy. And if you want to get connected to other bodies, call your family, great, and your friends, great, and protect them and nourish them, but be careful of the ones that are not you, whether that's a not you human or a not you species. It's all about you, where you is considered your body, or your body plural, people in this in-group. So my hopefulness, actually, especially after writing Intraconnected, was, when I had been in a forest and, with some colleagues alone for 3 days, and then had this experience of incredible openness of my identity to being a part of the forest and an aspect of all of nature. When my colleagues came out and said, oh, we were interdependent and interconnected and interwoven, all the INTER prefixes to those terms, which means between, it came time for my turn to speak. And I said, I really understand what you're saying, but for me, the experience was not interconnected. I was, I don't know. I was like, and I couldn't find the word. So I said I was intraconnected. There was a connectedness within the whole that this body called Dan was just a part of. And the body didn't disappear. My identity as Dan didn't disappear. I knew there was a Dan, but I knew I was as much the trees and the creek as this body called Dan. So I said interconnected. And when I went back to the place where we had technology and I could type out some of my notes from the 3 days, quote, alone in the forest, which is really more like all one in the forest, the word processor would not allow me to type intraconnected without changing it to interconnected. And I realized there was no word in English for this connectivity within the whole. So the notion that yourself is, yes, in your body, and also your relationships with other people, even those that don't have the same skin color, religious beliefs, nationality, geographical location, all that stuff, that you are part of a larger human family. And then if you expand that relational self even larger to expand it out to, I'm all of living beings. So that when you see a tree, you don't look at it as, oh, something I'm just going to cut down, I don't care. But you see it almost like you would see your leg. And you wouldn't cut down your leg. So then when you start feeling that, you realize, wow, okay, I am the earth. And I say I am using the word I in a broad sense. So people wanted to know, well, can I hold on to the individual that's me? And I go, yeah. They said, well, I don't need to get rid of me. I said, no. The idea is integration is you differentiate your link. So this is where another word came up.
Yeah.
Me plus we is this funny word in English, mwe, M-W-E. And what's funny about that is people realize they don't have to choose between an inner self and a relational self. You are both. And mwe is just a fun way to remind ourselves that we are both a me and a we.
So you can be working on yourself, expressing yourself authentically, trying to master certain passions and pursue certain things, but that doesn't have to come at the expense of the people around you.
Yeah.
Like you can do that and you can support the people around you. Other people don't have to lose in order for you to win.
Mm-hmm. Beautifully said.
And that's one of the problems, I think, and that's one of the things I feel that I developed as a child, is this idea that, which I feel I've mostly, if not all, let go of now through, practices we can talk about perhaps, but this realization that I can win and people around me can win.
Yeah.
Which is very freeing. It's very liberating.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple of questions, and some of these, I guess, relate to your upcoming book, Personality and Wholeness in Therapy, which I haven't read yet, and I'm looking forward to reading. But this idea of intentionality, are we living an intentional life or a reactive life? Some of that, I imagine, comes down to how you were raised as a child. If you were raised in an environment of danger, if you were raised in an environment where safety wasn't felt, you may have developed the worldview that the world's not safe. Okay, I need to make sure I sort myself out. Whereas if you were raised in an environment of love and safety, and there were people around you who were there to support you, your worldview is that, hey, listen, world's good, world's safe, like it's cool, like I can win and people around me can win, right? So that childhood piece must be important, I would imagine. I know you've written so many books on parenting, and you have some. I'd love to know some of your advice for parents, because the 4 S's framework, I think, is really, really powerful. But perhaps can you just speak to that idea first? How much does your childhood upbringing influence whether you live life intentionally or reactively?
Yeah. So having just finished this 20-year project called Personality and Wholeness in Therapy, I'm going to try to make this as succinct and directed toward your question as I can. But let's just start with the fundamental view that, when your body is developing in the womb, and as a fetus you're growing, you are developing a nervous system. Part of the influence on how that nervous system will be shaped is your genetics, determining that you're a human and not an elephant, for example, but also shaping in part certain propensities of your nervous system. Mm-hmm. Some are just random experiences that happen during gestation of how your nervous system develops. So now let's come to the moment where you're born. You are born, and at the moment you're born, you have something called temperament. And in this book, I actually propose with my colleagues 9 different kinds of temperament.
Okay.
So then, depending on the temperament, for example, it looks like about a third of the population has a temperament which pushes towards agency, where you really want to make sure you're asserting your embodied empowerment, you're having a sense of competency. And if it's frustrated, you feel irritated, angry, furious even. That temperament may make your experience of being in the world, when you're talking about how is it, can you give to the larger good, one way, especially now we're getting to the second layer, if your attachment is not secure, then you'll have a kind of a more rigid way in which temperament turns into personality. And then your anger may come out more readily, and you'll be more likely to want to have your own things done, your own way, this kind of thing. Depending on, there's lots of variations that I talk about in that book, but just say that anger is your emotion that's generated when you feel threatened. And we'll talk about that reactive state versus what you're calling the intentional state, which is a kind of receptive, open state. Another group is more the bonding group, and that temperament makes you more oriented towards having separation distress and sadness. So when you're getting reactive, you might get filled with this distress about, I'm not connected, because your drive is for relational connection. So that would be a different way, especially with non-secure attachment. Then you have a more rigid way your personality is, and you get more threatened with a sadness and separation distress. And then the third broad grouping that we've observed is that it's about basically a drive for certainty and predictability, so you can have safety. And in that predictability and certainty, when it's not there and you're frustrated, you get anxious and you get fearful.
Okay, so let me put something to you. Something I have realized and experienced in my own life is that certain things, certain aspects of who I thought I was were not actually who I was, they were who I became. Okay, and I'll give you a concrete example.
Yeah.
Now, listeners of this podcast may have heard this example before, so I'll try and sort of summarize the essence, because I really love your take on this. I was brought up, 2-parent family, older brother. My parents were Indian immigrants to the UK. So dad came in 1962, mum came in about 74, something like that, okay? So in a lot of immigrant families, and I can speak for an Indian immigrant family in the UK, a huge emphasis is put on academic excellence. So I can remember various incidents as a child when I'd come back from school, maybe at 5 or 6 or 7, I can't remember the exact age, with 19 out of 20, let's say. And there would never be a well done. It would always be, what did you get wrong?
Oh my.
Okay?
Yeah.
If I wasn't top of the class, it would like, who came top? Why weren't you top? Okay? Now, that may sound really toxic, and maybe when I first came across this and started to unpick my childhood, I may have considered it as toxic as well, but I don't anymore, because I believe there's multiple perspectives on every situation. So my parents, facing the discrimination they faced when they came to the UK back then, in their head, the way that they avoid their children facing the same problems is by academic excellence, because academic excellence equates to being a doctor, an engineer, or a lawyer, which equates to a good, secure job, right? The problem for me was, and I, of course, wasn't aware of this at the time, and this is the story I now tell myself as I reflect on my life and try and use what I've learned from my childhood to help make me a better, a more calmer, a more enlightened adult. I realized that I took on the belief at a young age that I was only loved, or I felt I was only worthy of love when I got full marks, when I was top of the class. And so, for much of my life, I considered myself very competitive. If you talk to any one of my close friends, they will tell you Rongan is one of the most competitive people you will meet. I would not lose at something, be it snooker, pool, run, whatever it is. I would make sure somehow that I won. Right? It's not a very it's not a very calm place to live from.
And what would happen if you didn't?
Yeah, this is really interesting. And I only really discovered this when writing my last book, Happy Mind, Happy Life, when I sort of realized I actually didn't enjoy winning. I just couldn't stand the thought of losing. Right? It's very, very different.
Yeah.
But here's the interesting thing, Dan, for me. I would have said I was competitive. My friends would say I was competitive. I thought, oh, that's who I am. I'm competitive. But it's not who I am. It was who I became. I am no longer competitive, genuinely. Like by doing a variety of different things, including internal family systems and all kinds of different things, which I've spoken about before, I've realized where that came from. I've moved beyond it. So in terms of personality, some people would have said, oh, your personality wrongness to be competitive. And I guess we can talk about the difference between personality and temperament. But in essence, what I'm trying to say is, and what I try and explain to people is that who you are today is not necessarily who you are. It may be, or a large part of it may be who you became. I find that very empowering because I now go, oh, well, what else about me potentially could I change if I wanted to? So I could tell you a lot more, but
Please do.
Well, in essence, I feel a lot of my patients in the past feel that the way they are is just the way they are. Well, this is just who I am. And maybe part of it is who they are, but maybe a huge part isn't. Maybe a huge part of who you think you are is an adaptation to your childhood for very good reason. And so I always like to empower people. So I believe that we can change a lot more about our lives than we give ourselves credit for. I think a lot of people feel that they're stuck with what they consider to be their personality, but how much of their personality is actually changeable and was a response, an appropriate response. Because if you take my competitiveness, it's a genius adaptation. If I think I'm only getting love when I'm top, well, developing the trait of being competitive is going to help push me to be the top. So I'll be loved, right? But as I've realized that, oh, actually, I'm loved anyway. I don't need that, right? And that's a long story of how I got to that point. But today I actually do genuinely, I just feel bloody fantastic, Dan. I feel calm. I feel non-reactive. I feel that I see joy everywhere in the world. I feel that I try and operate from a place of love rather than fear in most of my interactions. So I share that because I want people to know that you can change so much about who you think you are. Hey guys, as you know, sleep is a crucial ingredient for our overall health and our longevity. Yet these days, many people really struggle. 8 Sleep have a technology called the Pod, which can be fitted to your existing mattress like a fitted sheet. And it will automatically cool down or warm up each side of your bed, which can be especially helpful if you have a partner, as you can both have the ideal temperature that you want. The Pod can also detect snoring and automatically lift your head to improve your airflow, which hopefully will stop you snoring. If you want to give the Pod from 8 Sleep a go, all you have to do is click on this link and use the code LIVEMORE to get $350 off the Pod 4 Ultra, or you can click on the link in the description box below. It currently ships to United States, Canada, the UK, Europe, and Australia. Now, back to the conversation. You know a lot about personality. You said this book is a 20-year project you've tried to summarize in a book.
Yeah.
Do you have any comments on what I've just shared with you?
Oh, lots of comments. First of all, thank you for sharing your personal journey. It's very powerful to hear it. And, I think the message you're trying to give to everyone that be careful when you think some aspect of who you are, and that's in quotes, is fixed.
Yeah.
Then your own belief that it's fixed may make it so, right? So there's beautiful work by the scientist Carol Dweck on growth mindset versus a fixed mindset, where one of the things you can study is personality, And when you believe that's changeable, then things are changeable. On the other hand, there are ways of understanding, for example, how the brain forms early in life, so in utero, to create these things we call temperament. And you have kids, I've got kids who are now adults. Our two kids had very different temperaments.
Likewise.
For the first 2 days, you knew they had very different temperaments. And we can study that. There's some fabulous books. There's a beautiful book called Parenting with Temperament in Mind that some colleagues wrote that's just exquisite. And the key thing about temperament, if you're a parent listening, is to know that it isn't that one temperament is better than another. As a parent, your invitation is to just tune into who your child is, in quotes, and allow them to thrive given their temperament, rather than projecting your expectations onto your kid. I want an outgoing, energized kid who's able to take on any kind of new thing. And if that's not your kid's temperament, it's going to be a problem. That child is not going to really be seen by you, won't be easily soothed by you, won't particularly feel emotionally safe with you. And so that non-attunement to who they actually are, quote, temperament-wise, will actually intensify their very feelings of nervousness because they won't be seen by you. So that's one way of seeing how attachment experiences, which are your relationships with important caregivers in your life, how it actually shapes the regulatory circuitry of the brain, which would include, for example, you getting the message from your parents that says, hey, you got 1 out of 20 wrong. Why'd you do that? And just their nonverbal communication to you, or maybe they're explicit about it. Why didn't you get 20 out of 20? Makes you feel like, I want the love of my parents. And so I'm going to really do well. In fact, I'll not just do well in academics, I'll do well in everything.
Can I just jump in there just for a second? Because I think it's a really important point that perhaps I didn't make clear when explaining. I dearly love my parents, and I think they did a great job in raising me. Like, I really do believe that.
Yeah, I hear that.
And I believe they were doing that from a place of love. I really do. I believe that their intention, and this is quite a common immigrant type story. And certainly in Asian immigrants, you will hear this. Ever since I started sharing this story, the amount of people from immigrant families who get in touch with me and say, oh my God, thank you for verbalizing that. That was my experience as well. And I hope we get to talk about your wheel of awareness at some point. I feel that real evolution of our personal growth really comes when we actually no longer try and blame. So maybe when I initially came across this, I might have been frustrated. I remember I actually popped round to Mum's years ago when I was starting to come around. So I said, hey, Mum, why did you say that to me? Or Dad, why did you say that to me? And A, they don't even remember, right? And B, it was very clear to me that they just wanted the best for me. Like my mum once said to me, hey, look, we know how talented you are. We just wanted you to be the best that you could be. So I think a lot of the time with it's not necessarily what happened, it's the interpretation we give to what happened. So now I look back on that with love. I go, hey, Mum and Dad, I get why you did that. You wanted me to have the best life I could possibly have, right? So you were driving me to be the best I could be. The problem for me, and it's not blaming them, the problem for me was that I interpreted that, I think, as a sign that I'm not loved unless I get top marks. And so that has massively influenced my own parenting style with my children because I don't want them to feel that.
Right. And I hear you being really wonderfully respectful of your parents and really honoring them, which is really beautiful. The research, that Carol Dweck and others have done, looking at how parents reward in their comments, a child's efforts, for example, rather than the outcome of what they do, show that kids actually do better when parents really recognize the efforts.
Yeah.
You really put a lot of energy into this. You really cared. I can see how thorough you were. Wow, you did like that, right? Whereas kids who are only rewarded for the outcome, a result on a test or whatever, they develop this fixed mindset where they think, okay, it's all just about what I result in, not what I'm experiencing. Because with a growth mindset, Carol Dweck has shown, what you have is you have resilience. You were really fortunate. You have all these gifts. And so your parents' alignment and, really pushing for results, worked out fine. But imagine if it didn't.
Yeah.
And I know people, probably many people, where parents tried the exact same thing and their kids were not capable.
Agreed. And me too. I know that.
Whoa, the outcome for those children is really sad. They feel horrible about themselves because they couldn't get the marks their parents said, keep on striving. Imagine if that child just had a parent said, wow, I saw you really put your effort in. You got 14 out of 20. Last time you got 10 out of 20. Yeah, remarkable. Keep on with that effort. That's beautiful. Mm-hmm. Not beating them up for getting 14 out of 20 instead of 20 out of 20. So it worked out well with you and your parents. So I just want to say for anyone listening, the research is pretty clear. Let's focus on the effort that a child exerts rather than the outcome of what they result in.
I completely agree. And also just to add there, I think it's worked out well, not because of any achievement or success as defined by society that I've had in life. It's only ended up okay because I've gone in and explored my inner world and processed a lot of this, because I think for many years it wasn't okay in the fact I was achieving, but I felt incomplete.
So what was that like to feel incomplete?
So I think how it felt was hollow. So I feel that whenever I achieved, and yes, I am by society's metrics of success, sure, I've achieved a degree of success, definitely. But I think in many ways, achieving that success taught me that it doesn't make you happy, right? I got the outcomes that, my dad would have loved, but he never got to see, right? Mm-hmm. But getting those outcomes didn't lead to contentment. So going back to your original question, I feel one of the key things I learned was that you can achieve perfect or what you consider perfect outcomes and it still not fill the hole that you have inside yourself. So I think for me, it was very beneficial to get these high levels of success to teach me that. And it's kind of forced me, or it's encouraged me to go inwards and go and figure out, well, what does contentment look like? Because external validation sure as hell didn't do it for me. And so I really was set on this path, Dan, when my father died in 2013, because I was a huge part of, my adult life was spent caring for dad along with my mum and my big brother. So, I live very near my family house still now. Mum's still there. I live 5 minutes away. And so dad dying was it was the first time where I started to go inward. Until dad died, everything was outward for me, I think. When dad died, it was the first time I went inward to examine my life. Where did my beliefs come from? Where did my desire to become a doctor come from? What am I doing? So that's me trying to summarize a very, very long journey. Yeah. Did that make sense?
It makes total sense. And you used two words, the idea that there was a hollowness inside and something felt very incomplete. Can you just try to illuminate for us what did that feel like, hollowness?
It's so hard to put words to this because I feel that it's been years now since I moved beyond this. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, that's a really nice thing to go, I can barely remember what that used to feel like, right? Yeah. So I think that's a good thing. Mm-hmm. Nothing ever felt enough. Okay. I think going back to how we started this conversation, I think I felt reactive. And I think part of it was also this, I've got everything you could possibly have wanted as a child, yet I still want more. I'm trying to put words to something that I used to feel. I guess the contrast would be, last year I was in Sweden. My book Unhappiness came out there a year after it came out in the UK and the US, and I was there doing some promo for it. And I remember a Swedish journalist asking me in Stockholm, well, how do you know if you're happy? And it was a great question. And I was thinking about it. And then I think what came to mind in that moment was, I think, when you're happy, when you have this kind of sense of inner peace and you don't really want for anything. Like I feel I have enough and I am enough. Is this making sense?
Totally makes sense, yeah. I mean, it's really powerful to hear this. And, I really so deeply appreciate us being able to talk at this level of vulnerability and openness and rawness, There's, I think, a way that we can put a frame around this that might be a good way to connect with you. And then I want to know what happened after your dad died. We have a very similar history in certain ways. My dad died 12 years ago, and I live 7 minutes from my mom, who's 95 now, and our adult daughter lives, 4 minutes away, and our son lives 12 minutes away, So we have a pretty tight family. And
I love hearing that, because that's quite rare these days.
Yeah, it is.
So it's really nice to hear that for me, that other people do that as well.
Yeah. It's an important thing to have that feeling. The opposite of, hollowness is, I think, wholeness, to feel whole and to have this feeling of coherence rather than fragmentation or incompleteness. So can I give you a little just a download of this 20-year project? So picture the experience that we have when there is no separation, when there's nothing you have to do, when, there are no emergencies, like a siren we hear in the distance tells us there's some emergency. Someone has to go from being receptive to reactive, fighting, fleeing, freezing, or collapsing in a faint. You're just receptive, effortless being. And imagine, though there are variations of this, but imagine that we have a nervous system when we're in the womb that can remember, in what's called implicit memory, a feeling of just effortless being, of being not separated, of being whole. When in the womb, especially the last trimester, the last 3 months, you don't have to eat, you don't have to breathe, you don't have to make sure there are caregivers aware of where you are. All those things are taken care of in the womb. And sure, there are variations if your mother's stressed or you're hearing, painful things outside the womb. But in general, there's an effortless state of being that, let's just call that the experience of wholeness. You could go even further back if you want to go in terms of cosmically to the Big Bang, and when all we were potential in the universe, and then potential spread out into all this mass and stars and planets and moons in our bodies. But the point is that in the womb, and just like before the Big Bang, all there was just being. Then what's the difference between this sense of wholeness that we all experienced at some level in the womb, and now you're out, you've been born, however you got out here. What's the difference in your state of existence?
Well, when you're born and you're outside the womb, you are reliant on certain things. You need people, caregivers, parents, siblings, whatever it is, you need people to look after you, to bring you food, maybe your mother to breastfeed you if she's able to, warmth, shelter. And if those things are not there, you're going to feel isolated. You're going to feel that the world is not safe and that there's something wrong.
And what if those things never show up? What's going to happen?
Well, at one extreme, if those things never show up, you're probably going to end up dying.
Right. So you are now in a do or die situation.
Okay.
We call it working for a living, right? You got to make sure all those things you powerfully just said are there, and you achieve them by doing in various ways, right? You're just a baby, but there's a complete contrast of the effortless being, which we're going to name as wholeness, in the womb, that because you have a nervous system that's remembering stuff in something called implicit memory, which means the bodily sensations, the perceptions, the emotions, and even the behaviors, in this case, no behavior, you don't have to do anything. Those are remembered in an implicit memory. And here's the amazing thing about pure implicit memory. Research shows that when you take an implicit memory that's in storage and now retrieve it, it's activated and you don't know it's coming from the past. So what our hypothesis is that there's a feeling of restlessness when you're born because you know something that you implicitly are familiar with, that you implicitly can sense once was there, is not there. Even though you don't feel it's coming from the past, you just feel the contrast of this oomph, this sense of wholeness that's missing now, as you powerfully point out, right? We've never talked about this before, have we?
No.
But you articulated, exactly the setup, right? So now, depending on your temperament, whether it's about agency in one sensitive grouping, bonding in another sensitive grouping, certainty in another, we think that your experience is going to be, I'm going to be really frustrated or angry with this new non-wholeness setup. I'll have separation, distress, and sadness with this new non-wholeness setup. Or I'm going to be anxious and fearful in this new non-wholeness setup.
Is this for everyone?
For everyone.
Yeah, okay.
No matter their attachment.
Yeah, so what you're saying is, if we really think about it, is deeply, deeply profound. Because the way I'm hearing the information and the way it's sort of filtering through my brain and my existing beliefs and perceptions, I'm thinking, well, are you saying that a default state of being human is that you experience a separation from wholeness, and therefore is the journey, the real journey of being a human, to get back to the wholeness that we previously experienced?
You've just given the best summary of that book I've ever heard. That was a 20-year project that you just summarized beautifully. That personality is the different ways we're trying to get back to wholeness.
I literally can feel tingles all over my body at the moment. What about the journey through the birth canal?
Well, that we need to do research on that, but of course that can shape things too. What we feel is your temperament is set up in the subcortical, that is in the brain. You have a cortex and areas below the cortex we call sub for below cortex. The subcortical areas of the brain are what grows and mature to a very full extent in utero, in the womb. So that now you're going to have experiences that shape you that are going to be cortically responded to. So that's an experience that certainly can shape you, and we should study that. How you get out by cesarean section, a vaginal delivery. Yes, we should study that. That brief period will certainly impact memory in a certain way. But the larger picture is you have a temperament. A little sensitivity in one of these motivational networks for agency versus bonding versus certainty is going to set up more activation in that particular network for the first day, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then the way neuroplasticity, how the brain changes in response to experience, is that your own initial sensitivity or intensity or response to novelty, the classic ways we define temperament, if it's distributed across these 3 motivational networks in a slightly different way, by a week of age, a month of age, 5 months of age, your own initial small sensitivity is going to become a larger set of neural connections because it was just firing off more. Neurons are fired together, wired together. So now you're 6 months of age and you've got a temperament going. And not that you have you're temperamental, that classic way we use it, but more you have a feature to your nervous system. So we think, my colleagues and I, that this contrast of being whole in the womb, effortless being, is embedded in your implicit memory. And that embedding in the womb is so different from your actual ongoing, online, real-time experiences of being out here in the world for the rest of our lives, that this temperament is then activated, especially when we're challenged in certain ways, but in general in life. And then you have the attachment experiences you get, things your parents say or do for being seen, soothed, and safe, are going to then shape whether these temperament features become intensely molding your personality in a certain direction or kind of more mildly molding it. So we don't think it determines whether you're ABC, agency, bonding, or certainty, but that it intensifies the rigidity of your personality if your attachment's been not secure. Okay,
so temperament and personality.
Yeah.
These are separate things.
Well, let's not call them separate, let's call them distinct things. They are distinct. They're not separate in that personality emerges from temperament. That's our theory. So they're distinct. Temperament would be the subcortical proclivities that you're born with. They're not learned.
For someone who doesn't understand the term subcortical, can you just break it down for them?
Sure. So the brain, if you take your hand and put your thumb in the middle, if you're not driving, take a hand, put your thumb in the middle, put your fingers over the top. Where your fingers are folded over your thumb, that's the cortex, the higher part of the brain. That's the part of the brain that will develop in a huge way after you're born, and it responds to learning from experiential immersion, including what happens with your parents or what happens in school. If you lift up your fingers and see the thumb and palm, let's call these the subcortical areas. This includes regions that used to be commonly called the limbic area. People don't like to use that term anymore for complex reasons, but amygdala, hippocampus, hypothalamus are the formal names.
The more primitive parts of our brain.
The more primitive parts of the brain. We don't need to call them old mammalian because some people don't want us to use that name anymore, but that's fine. But they're more primitive and they develop earlier in development. So in the womb, if you lift up your thumb, you're now down to the brainstem. And in this limbic, what used to be called limbic and brainstem area, there are other areas too. Let's just call the whole region there beneath your fingers, sub, meaning beneath, cortical. And the importance here is that research has shown that you have many distinct motivational networks that are basically taking basic needs, like a need for agency, that is embodied empowerment. I have a sense of competence, autonomy. That's one network. It's very different in the subcortical regions to a distinct motivational network, anatomically and functionally very distinct, for bonding. This is for relational connections, for me being accepted by you when I arrived here. That deep network in me is activated. But then, when I'm walking to see you, I have a third motivational network we think is really important for personality, and its origins are in temperament, so we'll get to that in a moment. And that's for certainty, that is for predictability. Why is predictability important in life? Because if there's prediction, there's protection. So if I can know where I'm walking to get there in a certain time, I feel a certain kind of ease. And I get here, that's fine. And then when I meet you, my bonding network is activated. Is Rangan going to really accept me? Am I going to be okay? Am I wearing the right things? Am I saying the right things? For agency is, when I come, I need to go to the restroom? I'm too hot. Let me take my jacket off. Yeah. I take care of my bodily needs. So all these things, what's fascinating about it is these are three very distinct networks in the subcortical regions. And we have thousands of narratives from people in a system called the Enneagram that my colleagues are immersed in. It's not really my area, but we've been working together for 20 years to take those thousands of narratives and basically say, why do people speak in such different ways about their inner life? And then we went to my field, interpersonal neurobiology, where we put all these different fields together, especially neuroscience and developmental science. And what we think happens is that temperament is what you're born with, not learned. And that the reason people have all these very distinct narratives that fall into 9 different patterns is because you have what we call adaptive strategies to your own temperament.
That's personality.
And that's how you get personality. It's your adaptive strategy, and that you experience outwardly you experience it in your emotions, thought, and behavior. So the simplest way of defining personality, just to give a definition of it, is persistent patterns of emotion, thought, and behavior that exist across conditions, that is, situations and time. So it's not just a state of mind, I'm in this particular moment and it'll never come back. It's persistent. It's recurrent. It comes back.
Okay.
Yeah. That's the simplest way of defining personality. So we think personality can be more like a prison, especially when your attachment is not secure, or it can be more like a playground. But it may be we always have personality. That's a big question we can get to. And maybe you can go beneath personality to just open, receptive awareness. We'll get into that. But temperament may always persist. So they're distinct, but temperament, we think, gives rise to personality.
It's a helpful analogy. A lot of the time on this podcast, we talk about how much genetics play a role and how much our lifestyle and environment plays a role, okay, in terms of our risk of getting sick or Alzheimer's or something like that, okay? And so in the world I operate in, we commonly talk about, well, you have a genetic predisposition, or you may have a genetic predisposition to something, let's say type 2 diabetes. But that's probably 5 or 10% of it, because 90% or so of your risk is going to come from how you live your life, what you're exposed to, what's the environment, okay? So, which is, I think, hugely empowering for people who are able to make different choices. Of course, not everyone is able to. Can I look at what you've just said through a similar lens? Not quite the same thing, but you're born. And once you're born, that process or some process, I don't know where genetics sort of feature here, but you have a temperament, like your genetic predisposition for type 2 diabetes, right? And then it's your lifestyle that determines what actually happens. Is it similar in the sense that we're born with a temperament, with a tendency, but then our personality develops on top of the temperament in response to various environmental inputs, including the way we were brought up?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that works.
That works totally. And to build on that, number one, it's not just genetics. It can be just, let's use the word innate. That is, you can have just the way you were leaning in the womb. For example, I just did a workshop where they were identical twins, and they had different personalities, and they have identical genes, but one was leaning to the left and one was leaning to the right, and the brain develops. So the initial sensitivity that we call temperament may not have that big a genetic component, but it's still innate, that it was inherent when you were born. You didn't learn it. That's the important thing.
Okay, so just as you can't change your genes, although you can change the expression of them, and that the sort of phenomenon of epigenetics in terms of how we live our life, what we're exposed to, if we look at what you've just said through the lens of the story I relayed to you about my competitive personality trait that I no longer have.
Yeah.
Okay. Are you saying that I was born with an innate tendency, and because of certain experiences in my life when I was a young child, those experiences shaped me to develop the personality traits of competitiveness? I'm first of all interested whether you think that's a reasonable assertion that I'm making based on all the study and science that you've written about and been going through for many, many years. But also that definition of personality, persistent patterns of emotion, thought, and behavior. I'm just trying to look at that through the lens of competitiveness. I think it was a persistent pattern in my life. I certainly would say my thoughts, I had competitive thoughts, I had competitive behaviors. is what I said to you, does it feel accurate to you based upon your study?
Yeah. Well, in academia, the main view of personality is called the Big Five. This is the accepted view. And this is what we're going to even get a little further beyond what we're talking about, just to say these are observable traits, personality traits. And they include things that spell the word ocean. So it's openness, O, versus closedness. C is conscientiousness versus carelessness. That's OC. E is extroversion versus introversion, which is really referring to your sociability. Do you like to go out and hang out with people, or you'd rather be by yourself, introverted? Then OCEA is agreeable or not agreeable. And N is neuroticism, meaning are you kind of neurotic or are you kind of cool as a cucumber?
And do you have to pick one of the five, or
no? You get all five. You get various degrees. So this is not. We don't think there's something called a personality type. So we don't use the word type anymore. We talk about patterns, meaning you can have all sorts of degrees of each of those five. Now that's the classic view from like the last 30 years of formal university-based academic research on personality.
To make sure you're taking action after watching this video, I've created a free guide to help you build healthy habits. We can all make short-term change, but can those changes become a fundamental part of our life? Often they don't. And that's why in this free guide, I share with you the 6 crucial steps you need to take. They're really, really effective. If you want to get hold of that free guide right now, all you have to do is click the link in the description box below.
Now, when you go beneath those 5 factors, and we've been doing that with our approach, Carol Dweck came up years later with a different approach now that uses the exact same notion that I'm describing to you here. So it's a very exciting moment. I just learned about this a couple of days ago.
Oh, wow.
So it's super exciting. But consiliently, that is independently, it's this emergence of this notion that you're born with a temperament, that she uses this great acronym called BEATS, that there are beliefs, emotions, and what she calls action tendencies that are equivalent to what we're calling adaptive strategies, that are basically how your temperament comes into your personality. And she shows the relationship of those things to the ocean Big Five personality traits. So that's a thing you can look up for her. For us, we're looking at how attachment can intensify the non-functional ways your particular combination is. And I haven't demonstrated why the 3 get into 9. And that's another interesting thing, because we think another aspect of temperament, and a research colleague of mine actually found this in the brain independently. So another form of consilience is some people are very inward, different from introversion, not about your sociability, just their energy is kind of inward, they're focusing inward. Other people focus outward, their energy is outward. Some people are kind of a shimmering between inward and outward, so you're both inward and outward at the same time. We call that dyadic, meaning it's a dyad is a pair, so it's pairing inward and outward. When you put those 3 orientations of attention, which I've made up a term, a tendency, the tendency of attention, is a tendency inward, outward, or dyadic as both. When you combine that with the ABC, agency, bonding, and certainty, you get 9. We now have tens of thousands of narratives that beautifully fold into these 9 patterns when people tell the story of their life. So when Carol Dweck came up with independently, just theoretically, this model that's virtually identical to our model, it was so exciting because our model was derived from listening to tens of thousands of people talk about their lives. So, it's an exciting moment. And in this view, to get to your point, competitiveness is not in the Big Five. So if I were a university researcher, which I'm not, and was trying to put the Big Five on there, I would say, listen, we don't see competitiveness. Certainly it's a feature of who you are, but it's not a formal listing in the academically accepted Big Five. It's not about whether you're open, conscientious, extroverted. It's not about your agreeableness, depending on how you use your competitiveness. It's not about whether you're neurotic or not. You could have any variation of ocean, an academic would say, and still be competitive or not competitive. So we don't look for competitiveness, was what they would say, I'm sure.
What would you say?
So for me, I would say that my best friend, for example, in high school, was incredibly competitive. He loved playing tennis. I would play with him and I would just laugh when I would miss the ball. And he would go, come on, try, let's beat each other, whatever. I just didn't care. I never cared about that. For him, he's always watching the sports page in the paper. I said, why do you do that? He goes, you kidding? I want this team to win. I really want them to beat the other team. I never had a moment in my body where I cared ever about that. It felt like it was a temperament thing. I know his family. I think he had secure attachment. I did not have secure attachment in my family. You'd think I'd be the competitive one trying to achieve something. So it could be that your competitiveness, and this is a question I'm going to ask you, and maybe in general, but let's look for you in particular. If we take this notion that personality in all its dimensions is a lifelong journey to wholeness, that could it be that for the temperament in you, which we haven't figured out yet, but could it be that competitiveness was a way of getting some sense of wholeness if you won? And that, as you said, it wasn't that I really wanted to win, I just didn't want to lose.
Yeah.
And that you got a wholeness when you won, and that now you found, in ways that I'd love to know about, what happened 10 years ago after your dad passed, something may have happened where you found another route to wholeness. So it made competitiveness not necessary.
Yeah.
So that's my question for you.
It's so fascinating. I do believe that competitiveness was, through that lens, I can make a case that it was an attempt, I would say a misguided attempt to get wholeness. So if part of wholeness is love, then I think competitiveness was a way to receive love.
Mm-hmm.
Competitiveness was my way of thinking I was going to get love, but I don't think it brought me that.
Yeah.
So it may have been an attempt, but it was a failed attempt. And so the competitiveness that led to straight A's in medical school and excelling at, all kinds of different things, which was how I was brought up, that I need to excel. Yeah. And this is another thing, and you may have come across this with some of your clients. One thing a lot of Asian immigrant kids get told in the UK, and I'm pretty sure it's the same in the US, and it's not with any discrimination or racism. It really isn't. It's, you've got to be better than your white counterparts. Mm-hmm. Right. So that's drilled into me. I can't speak for every family.
That's a culturally learned thing, right?
So we learned that at a young age.
Sure.
And I know about the discrimination my parents faced and my dad faced only in the weeks leading up to his death. He never, ever told me once. He never complained. He got on with life. He just, honestly, I only learned about this right towards the end, about various things that happened. And I have a lot of compassion for mum and dad and how they would have tried to bring me up, because, they dearly loved and love me and my brother. And their desire for us to excel as best as we could was a desire for us to be accepted and not face the struggle that they faced, right? So I get it. And also, if you really want to look at this in a very zoomed out, big picture way, I'm actually glad they did. Because I don't feel I would have learned the lessons that I've learned in life and had the realizations that I've had without that experience.
Yeah.
I'm glad I had the competitiveness, the emptiness, the hollowness. I'm glad. Mm-hmm. Because now I can really appreciate the wholeness, the calm. And I don't think I would have. Was competitiveness an attempt back to wholeness? Yes, probably, although a misguided attempt. I don't know how this seems to you. You're talking about your friends and how we'd look at the sports pages. Well, I used to. I don't anymore. I don't care about competitive sport anymore. But for much of my life, I was a diehard Liverpool Football Club fan, right? I would go to games. I'd travel around Europe to watch them. Like I was all in. And I can remember being at university in Edinburgh. It was either 98 or 99. Liverpool's arch rivals, Manchester United, ended up winning the Champions League. And I was out in a bar in Edinburgh with my friends watching it, hoping like hell United lost. They were 1-0 down, right? And in injury time, they scored 2 goals.
Oh my.
I was devastated. I was literally devastated that United had won. That's who I was back then, right? I still think I was a nice guy, but I think that shows how my wiring was at that point, where why should whether Man United won or not affect me? Like, I was a Liverpool fan, right? But it did. I was really, really pissed off. I can remember it. But what's interesting, as I no longer am competitive, because I'm not, I'm also no longer interested in sport in that way. I'm interested in playing sports myself and getting better, but I don't care what Liverpool or Man United or Man City are doing. And those desires I had fit the person who I was back then. But I'm not that person anymore. So therefore, those hobbies don't fit anymore.
So what do you notice right now in your body when you are reflecting on this change through the lens of somehow I was trying to get to wholeness by identifying with the Liverpool team, and when United won, it just was so meaningful to me. And now, with whatever has happened in all these years, you feel the difference. What do you notice in your body?
Well, when I was describing that story, I felt a tightness. And as I think about my relationship to achievement and sport and these things now, I kind of feel loose. I feel loose and it feels free.
It feels free, yeah. Yeah, so as you just let that freedom be there, right now, the energy that was put into 2 big things: belief, some belief that, Liverpool, them winning would mean something in my life, and identity is, who am I? Well, I'm a Liverpool fan. That's who I am. That's my team. That's my in-group. We come back to kind of where we started, right? So there was something about identity that is not just in our bodies. It can be a sports team, as you're seeing. And that identity gave us something we haven't mentioned, which is belonging. You could belong, and if your team wins, you win.
Yeah.
Right? Because you belong, because that's your identity. Now, this ABC business, agency, bonding, certainty, they're all about belonging, all of them. They do it in different ways. We can go into the 9 patterns and we can just name them briefly, but just to say this, that someone might experience a little bit differently, because you were speaking of being loved and having a connection that would happen somehow if things were right, in getting things right when you be, achieving these things. Other people might feel they had a competence and empowerment, not just acceptance, right? And still others would feel like they were safe. If I get 20 out of 20 on a test, I'm safe. I'll go ahead in university or whatever. But what I've heard you say in a beautiful way is that it really comes down to relationships for you. So it'd be interesting if we ever take time to actually go through the 9 patterns to see where you ultimately find is your kind of baseline, kind of what you lead with in life. And these, I think, are changeable. And ultimately, here's what I think goes on. When people grow, like whatever the growth process you did, for me, it was the wheel of awareness and all sorts of things. We can talk about that if you want. But this way of entering open awareness, where the things you're aware of on the rim of this metaphoric wheel are seen as very distinct from the experience of awareness in the hub. We can get into that. But just to say that experience allows a person to realize that there's even something beneath temperament, which is underneath personality itself. And when you start feeling that, it's the wholeness that we seek. And that can be experienced in lots of ways. So for my particular patterns, it may be needing some kind of predictability, needing some kind of certainty. And so however that might happen, a routine, doing something with my wife, being a certain way I'm connected to my mom, there's a certain certainty to that gives me a sense of wholeness. Maybe for you, it'd be more relational. Other people might need to just make sure I'm competent at what I do. And I have this sense of, empowerment, And what's interesting when you do that is that beneath all those three things, the ABC, is this pure sense of wholeness. And my experience in working with people over these many years in this model of personality is it's just kind of like what you're suggesting. Personality traits, like let's say competitive is one, or, needing to be the best on something, or needing to do this or do that. When we relax that rigid prison of a personality through developing secure attachment, number one, but also accessing what I call a plane of possibility, this open, spacious ease of being and being whole, then all those things that come up, whether it's this drive for agency or drive for, bonding or a drive for certainty, you breathe beneath them. You may see them come up, and it's almost like your personality, which was built on top of your temperament, instead of being a really imprisoning set of restricted ways of being, becomes more like a playground. So for example, if I go camping, I'm in the certainty vector is what I call it. So you can be sure when I go camping with my family, it's a sunny day, but you never know. It's autumn. I'm going with 4 family members. I bring a jacket for myself. I say, does anyone want a jacket? They go, no. They don't have jackets on. I bring 4 extra jackets. We get in the car. We drive to the place. A storm comes. It's freezing and wet. And they go, oh my God, we don't have the right gear. We have to go back. Dan, and they know.
You got it.
I got it. I said, here are your jackets, even though they told me not to bring them. Yeah. I don't have to make them wear them. It's not like I push them on them. But, because I'm in a pattern of personality that always goes to the worst case scenario. And then when that was a prison for me, when I was, doing physical medicine.
Did you say prison?
A prison.
Yeah, that totally rings true. Living like that, for me, was living in a prison.
Yeah, say more.
Mental cage.
Yeah, exactly, a mental cage.
That you don't know you're in until you're not in it. And then you're like, oh, wow.
Exactly.
That's a constricted way to live.
Yeah. So this whole, approach of this PDP business, patterns of developmental pathways, is to allow your personality built from your temperament and intensified by your attachment insecurity to become from that constraining prison more like to a playground. So then, the worst case scenario goes, I go, oh, there might be a storm. You guys want jackets? No. And I go, I'm going to bring them anyway. I throw them in the back of the car. Then we're going, the storm shows up. So I'm happy that I was a kind of questioning pattern, that I questioned the weather person and whether they were right or not. I questioned even my relatives saying they didn't need it. When I was doing physical medicine, this personality pattern, when I was in pediatrics, for example, if I got a referral from another pediatrician, I never believed that the diagnosis that they had come to was accurate. And I would not necessarily test the kid again, but I would go over the test findings, make sure the exam that was done was accurate, make sure it was quality, and repeat it if I needed to. And there were many times when I would find things that my colleagues wouldn't, because I'm in what I would call the questioning pattern. That's my personality. Another person would say, hey, that was an esteemed, expert in X, Y, or Z. Why would you question them? Well, I'm a questioning pattern. That's what I do. Yeah. So if you're going on a camping trip, each of these 9 patterns has a great positive feature. I'm going to bring the extra jackets, and you're not going to have to go home. There are other patterns, if we go through all 9, and we'd be fun to see where you might lead from. That's what I say. And ultimately, when you tap into all 9 of these patterns, you start feeling this freedom of wholeness, and it's an ease of being where, you're not imprisoned by it anymore.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. To make sure you are taking action after watching this video, I have created a free special guide to help you improve your sleep and reduce fatigue. Now, in my clinical experience, most people who are struggling to sleep are doing something unconsciously in their day-to-day life that is negatively impacting their ability to sleep at night. So in this free guide, I share with you 5 of my very top tips that I have seen transform the lives of many of my patients. So if you want to get hold of this guide, all you have to do is click on the link in the description box below. It's fascinating, this for me. A few things just to share with you through the lens of this competitiveness. And I've thought a lot about this because for me, it's been really night and day to see I was competitive, now I'm not. This is interesting. I thought it was who I was, but it isn't because I'm no longer it.
Right. It was an adaptive strategy that you could relax and release.
I really believe that to be the case. It was an adaptation. So one thing I've noticed with my children is, and look, the most important thing to my wife and I is how we bring up our children. There's nothing more important, and we spend a lot of time and energy and intention thinking about it and trying to be there, be present with them, do things with them, praise effort, not outcomes, all these kind of things, right? And we must cover your 4 S's before we finish today's conversation at some point for sure. But what I've noticed is that they seem to really enjoy doing various things or various sports and music and other passions in a way that I don't think I did. Like, I had to be really good at them to enjoy them. I had to be able to excel at them. And I've been really conscious to not put that onto my kids. So I see my kids just enjoy them for the sheer pleasure of doing them. They don't have to win.
Yeah.
They don't have to push themselves. And it's been really interesting for me to try and process this because this is not how I was.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Rangan, as you're saying this, it's so interesting. I think my wife, who's also a barrister like your wife, we have very parallel lives. When we were raising our kids, we wanted them to experience this kind of enjoyment of stuff. And so when our son was young and he took piano, he was really enjoying just playing with the keys, just playing it. And his teacher, I overheard him one of the lessons, said when he came in one day after he'd been practicing during the week, he did it well. He did the piece well. She goes, you did it perfectly. Oh, I knew you were a good boy. And he quit.
Yeah.
He quit. And we could not get another piano teacher to just let him have the joy of music. So he quit. Then we told him the story that when he was 12, before he's a teenager, he had to pick up music again. And that's just a family tradition, which it wasn't, but we said it because we wanted somehow from 5 onward, and we could see he liked music. So he picked up, we were doing a lot of skateboarding, and we were at the skateboard shop next to a music store. He goes, I'm almost 13. I said, yeah. He goes, I guess I have to do that instrument thing. I said, yeah. So we go to the music store. He picks a guitar. It turns out he falls in love with the guitar. He has a guitar teacher, the head of the school, who just lets him love playing. Mm-hmm. No saying you got to do it right or wrong. No competitive performances, nothing. And we couldn't get him to stop playing. Now he's a professional musician. You can listen to his music. Alex Siegel. When he was done with high school, he was so amazing. People thought he was an amazing musician. He applied to music school, got in with a scholarship to the most competitive music school, and he turned it down. So I called my best friend's father, who was a musician. I said, I'm so confused. He loves music. He got into this incredible program, and he's turning it down. He wants to just study regular educational stuff. And my friend's father goes, that's brilliant. And I go, what's brilliant about it? He goes, if you want him to stop loving music, have him go to music school. I said, I am so confused. He goes, just let him find who he is as a person and let the music be expressed through him, not to impress some music teacher that he's doing it right and all these other competitive things. Let him find his own way, which is what he did. And you can listen to the outcome. So for Alex Siegel, the musician, what Caroline, my wife, and I were always interested in developing, and Alex and his sister Maddie, was an inner compass where they could find out what really mattered to them and then let that inner compass stay with them no matter what was going on. So Maddie also has an artistic capacity. She wanted to be literally a drawing artist. She tried that out in high school. And she said, I think I love science more. And now she's getting her doctoral degree in environmental science. And that's her thing. But an inner compass allowed the two of them to find their way in life as adults. So I say this because what you're doing with your kids by focusing on their inner experience of effort really lets them build this inner compass. And that's what we want to do. The wheel of awareness practice that you mentioned earlier, it's a way of developing an inner compass for us as adults, but even for adolescents. It's a drawing for younger kids. But what it does is it allows you to say, look, you're a human being in a human body, and you have a mind that has this amazing thing called consciousness. Consciousness allows you to have choice and to facilitate intentional change. So we're going to integrate consciousness with this practice called the wheel of awareness. Integration means we're going to differentiate the rim of things you can be aware of, like what you hear or smell or see, from the actual experience of knowing, we call awareness, in the hub. And you'll see Maddie's drawings actually in this book, Aware, because she's my artist for all my books. And what we're able to do is then, I did this with tens of thousands of people in person before the viral pandemic hit, collected their experiences in the wheel, and to summarize that 100 pages that we put in that book, Aware, I'll say this: it looks like pure awareness is a state where energy, which moves along what's called a probability distribution curve. So when I think a thought and I say ocean, it's way up here as a certainty, 100% certainty. I said ocean. But if I drop down to all the words I could say, and you and I share, let's say, 1 million words, it's in a pool of 1 million words sitting there before I say them. There, in pure awareness, is what I'm going to suggest to you is where it comes from. In that space of what's called pure potential is where awareness arises from. Now you have a 1 out of 1 million chance of guessing it. So now I say Pacific Ocean or Atlantic Ocean and all these things I might say. Here's the issue. With the wheel of awareness practice, people drop into this timeless state where they feel whole, they feel love, they feel content, they feel complete. The wheel of awareness is useful for minor to medium levels of depression, anxiety in various forms, trauma if it's used carefully. Even patients I've had who have terminal illnesses, who have the panic of dying, they do the wheel. When they can access the hub, which is part of the practice where you're moving this singular spoke around the whole rim, part of it is you bend the spoke of attention. It's a metaphor, but an intentional focus into the hub itself. You experience pure awareness. The wholeness people experience there, the love they experience there, frees them from the previous belief that, oh my God, all I am is my body. And if this body is dying, then I, in quotes, am disappearing. When in fact, they come to feel I'm part of a much larger wholeness to the universe. This body gets 100 years perhaps to live in this existence, but I'm just much bigger than my brain, bigger than my body. And that's what happens when you get to this state of massive openness. Now, I'll say, when you look at what pure awareness is, it's a state of brain firing that is extremely not committed. It's uncertain. And in that sense, the brain becomes more like a hose, more like a conduit, rather than a constructor of previously learned configurations. So you enter this state of a kind of beginner's mind and openness, maybe more like the effortless being we had in the womb. And so what happens, I think, is that when you come out of the wheel of awareness practice and your, quote, personality of you're Rangan, I'm Dan, you come back, when you come back to these states of old identity, if you're doing an integrated process of therapy or reflection after the wheel, what happens is you relax those, I call them plateaus, these plateaus of learned identity. And instead of just being a me, you become more a living MWE. And that feeling of contentment that you're talking about, I think, is where identity as a separate self relaxes.
Yeah.
This wholeness starts to suffuse. It starts to fill every moment when you're living. And sometimes, of course, you enter back into personality, and I can get fearful. Maybe someone else gets angry. Someone else gets sad. Sure, we live in a body, so temperament continues to activate that. But with practice and a life, you can live with this axis. I call it the plane of possibility, where all those possibilities are. So with a colleague, Alyssa Eppel, and two of my interns, we wrote a chapter for a textbook of why does mindfulness, why does being present, why does this open acceptance, why does it lead to a change in telomerase levels, the enzyme that repairs the ends of the chromosomes? Why does that state of openness and kindness, why do those lead to a change in the epigenetic controls that reduce inflammation? Why does it lead to cardiovascular improvements in health? Why does it lead to improvement in immune system functioning? Why does it lower stress? In that chapter, you'll see this in the book Aware, what we write about is that when you can access that open awareness, you called it living with intention. I would say it's living with intention with receptivity, that this receptive state allows this whole field within your body to achieve these 5 physiological changes, and even your brain becomes, in ways we can study structure and function, more integrated, differentiated areas are more linked. And that's, in some studies, been shown to be the best correlate of every measure of well-being we have. So the Wheel of Awareness, just to sum that up, includes the 3 pillars that research shows lead to these 5 physiological changes and integration in the brain, the growth of integration in the brain. And those are, you strengthen attention to be more focused, you have awareness become more open, and you make intention kinder. So focused attention, open awareness, kind intention, those 3 pillars of mind training allow you to cultivate this deep sense of well-being that I think is, if someone says, oh, I've listened to Rangan and Dan, what do I do? If you do the Wheel of Awareness practice, what my colleagues, my students, my patients, what people in workshops have experienced when they do this on a regular basis, they start feeling a shift in their personality. So instead of being a prison, it moves towards a playground. So instead of all the insecurities we have, they start feeling this wholeness, which I think is what the whole journey of personality is all about.
Yeah, I mean, I love it. So much to reflect on. The way I think about things, Dan, I'm always trying to think of root causes, and I'm always trying to simplify concepts. And so for a little while now, I've come to the conclusion, the belief that if you're coming from this place of open awareness and intention and compassion, it feels to me that in essence, you're operating from a place of love instead of operating from a place of fear, which goes back to how we started this conversation. You're operating from a place of intention, or you're operating from a place of reactivity. I don't mean to oversimplify the complexity of your work, because I know it's much more than that. But does any part of that ring true?
Yeah, well, here's what I would like to ask you about. A lot of it rings true, and one part of it I want to really do a little inquiry with you about.
Okay.
When you use the word intention, what do you mean?
I guess I mean the opposite of being reactive.
Okay.
So other people are doing certain things. I woke up feeling a certain way, therefore I'm going to act in a certain way. When I say intention, for example, one sort of practical thing might be, like I always have a bit of routine in the morning about, I do various things, meditation, breath work, some movement, some journaling. You know, I have a series of practices that I try and do each morning. And one of the things I try and end with is thinking about how I want to show up in the world that day. You know, and I find that when I'm intentional about my mornings, And if I say to myself that I want to be a loving, kind, and compassionate person today, I'm much more likely to be that person. Does that answer your question?
It does. And so I'm going to push back a little bit, if I could, on your use of the word intention. I totally hear you, and I resonate with it completely. Mm-hmm. The brain does have these two states, a reactive state and what's usually called a receptive state. Mm. In the reactive state, you go to the 5 Fs: fighting back, fleeing, freezing, meaning you temporarily paralyze yourself, fainting or flopping, meaning you feel helpless, there's nothing to do, you collapse. And then higher up in the brain, those are all subcortical. In the cortex, you have fawning, where you try to take care of your aggressor, right? So those are the 5 Fs: fighting, fleeing, freezing, flopping or fainting, and then fawning. So those are reactive. That's when you feel threatened. You can't think clearly. And here's my pushback on you. The flopping, no, it's not intentional. The other 3 first ones are intentional, meaning the brain is activating a set of firing patterns that have a goal-directed behavior to them. That's a way of defining intention.
Okay, interesting.
A goal-directed behavior. So I have a sadistic relative in our family, and he intentionally hurts people.
Okay.
This person has stated, I'm intentionally trying to hurt you.
Yeah.
And so it was a goal-directed behavior to cause pain. Yeah. That's called a sadist.
Well, first of all, I love that and I welcome that. Yeah. I genuinely do. And so I think perhaps it's more accurate to go, as you use, reactive versus receptive.
Receptive. And within receptivity, and this is maybe my own bias, and you've said it beautifully in so many ways today, receptivity, I think, accesses this plane of possibility.
Yeah.
And I've done this now literally with over 50,000 people.
Wow.
And when people get in that hub of that wheel, one of the most common terms they say is love.
Yeah.
So I think when people get receptive, they're dropping into that plane of possibility, the hub of the wheel. They're accessing the love, which as a scientist, as a physician, a fellow physician, what I'll say is this. I think the reason people use the linguistic term love when they get into the plane of possibility is all potentiality is linked there. And like when you love your wife, you're linked to your wife. When you love your kids, you're linked to your kids. When you love a sport or you love a book or you love music, you're linked to the music, the sport, the book. Linkage, maybe it sounds reductionistic, but I think we use the linguistic term love for that. So there's massive linkage in that plane of possibility, the hub of the wheel. Now, if we can assume that when you become receptive, you open up to the love that is like the fabric of the universe.
Yeah.
And you let that kind intention become the form of intention that arises, not the sadist knowing I don't care, I'm not kind, I'm going to hurt you. That's my intention.
Yeah.
So how does that feel for you?
Well, it feels great. And it totally resonates. And I can see what you mean about a kind intention versus a toxic intention.
Yeah.
Right? So you can be intentional in many different ways. So I thought that was a beautiful explanation. We've gone into so many different areas I wasn't anticipating us going into. Just to make sure that this is really practical for people who've sort of hopefully been inspired and they've found something that's connected with them and thought, wow, I want to learn more. So I have a few questions for you.
Yes.
You've mentioned the Wheel of Awareness a few times and you've touched on some of the concepts within it. If people want to learn more about the Wheel of Awareness, where would you direct them?
Yeah. So you can go to my website and do it for free, Dr. Dan Siegel, DrDanSiegel.com. And just go to resources and you'll find the wheel.
Great.
And then there's a little companion book called Becoming Aware. That's an extract of the bigger book, Aware. Those would be the 2 books to get.
So and for people who want to learn more,
it's like a 21-day challenge. Like, here's learning the Wheel of Awareness in 21 days. Yeah.
Okay, so they can go there.
Yeah.
Before we get to the 3 or the 4 S's of parenting, with the understanding that everyone's different and we all respond to different things, are there some practices, daily practices, routines that you have seen time and time again help people tap in to that more open and aware state?
Yes, absolutely.
And can you sort of briefly share some of them so people
Sure.
can really understand
Sure.
what we're talking about here?
Well, the wheel of awareness is something I encourage all my patients to do. I do it every day. You get this incredible integrative process and accessing the spacious receptive state. It's like a 20-minute meditation, basically. And then there's a beginning one, and then an intermediate one, and then an advanced one. And if you want to do it like slowly over 21 days, if you're new to it, that Becoming Aware book would be a good one to do.
And although I keep trying to get to the 4 Ps, there's just too much gold everywhere else.
Yeah.
Did you not at one point share an experience that was it in Baltimore when you took some black-skinned folk and some white-skinned folk and put them
that's
together?
right.
Yeah, can you just share that and how powerful the wheel of awareness was there? Because that was, when I heard that, it was profound for me.
Yeah, and that I think I talk about that in the book Interconnected. I think that's where it is. There was a beautiful, beautiful senior congressman from Baltimore, worked in Washington, D.C., named Elijah Cummings. And I had the deep, deep privilege of Elijah asking me to come to Baltimore where there was a lot of murder going on, and asked me to meet with a group of people who were African-American, black-skinned, European descent, white-skinned, who had never met with each other before, to see if we could allow these leaders in their communities to have some kind of collaboration. So we brought them into a space, and you could feel the tension. People didn't trust each other. They were looking, with very suspecting eyes, and it didn't feel very comfortable. So I guided people through the wheel of awareness practice in the room. Most of them have never meditated before in their life. And in the practice, 2 things came out when people finally discussed it, was bending the spoke around into the hub itself, which just experiences pure awareness, this sense of wholeness, this sense of love. And the other was the 4th segment of the rim, which you do after you basically have done this bending of the spoke business. You then go to the 4th segment. It's a relational sense where you start to feel the connections with other people in the room, people in your community, people out in the country, and then to all living beings. And so it builds this kind of connection and kind intention. So afterwards, the feeling in the room was completely different. And Elijah at that meeting said, "What did you just do? It's magic." And people could now talk to each other, and there was this openness, and people were really vulnerable across, the racial divides. And he was like blown away. And I said, "Elijah, I don't think it's magic. I think that people live on their rims with what they've been taught in society. And some of it's just in-group, out-group distinction. But when you get to that hub, when you get to pure awareness, when you get to the wholeness that we're all seeking.
Receptiveness,
exactly.
Yeah.
Then you see, just like this forest Pandopopulus that I also talk about in the Interconnected book, you see that we're just, in that forest, there's 48,000 quaking aspen trees, but when you go 6 inches beneath the surface, you realize there's one root ball. You test the DNA, you realize it's one tree. So that metaphor, really, it's an actual forest, but is that all of our bodies are just manifestations like Pandopopulus of the same root ball. And once they do the wheel of awareness and they get receptive, they look with love to the face of the person sitting next to them, sitting across the room from them.
That they previously saw with hate.
That they saw with hate or fear and were terrified of. And Elijah and I just did the rest of the morning, working with people now when they came from this place of connection. I do this with parliaments who are having fights about things, and people can get into that receptive space relatively rapidly. Not everybody does, but when you get just enough people getting there, they bring the love into the room. And I say it's like candlelight, If you have one candle that's lit, then it can light up another one, and it doesn't make the light go away from the first one, and you can start to spread the light.
Oh, I love it. I absolutely love it. I hope everyone goes and actually checks it out and does the Wheel of Awareness meditation on there. The 4 P's of parenting.
Yeah, the S's, yeah.
The 4 S's.
No, but the 4 P's, there are. Caroline Welsh my wife wrote a beautiful book called The Gift of Presence, which talks about the 4 P's.
Okay, so let's get to the S's.
So yeah, that's funny. She'll probably think you were channeling her. Yeah, so to give like a very short background so people understand, I used to be in pediatrics. I then trained in psychiatry and child psychiatry. Then I became an attachment researcher. So I'm trained to study parent-child relationships through the scientific lens of a form of developmental science where we study attachment. And one of my main areas of focus was parent states of mind. And what that means is you can dive into the mind of you as a parent with something called the adult attachment interview. And with the most robust power over anything else, even someone watching you at home for a year, we can predict how your child will be attached to you, whether it's securely or non-securely. And that security of attachment of your child essentially predicts all sorts of things like your child's emotional resilience, their capacity for mutually rewarding relationships with others. We call it an attachment stance or attachment strategy. And security is what you want to aim for as best you can. The great news from this field of attachment research, which I'm trained in, is that it isn't what happened to you that will determine if your child is securely attached to you. It's how you've made sense of what happened to you. And the importance of that finding cannot be overstated. In other words, people sometimes come to me and say, oh, terrible things happened to me in my childhood and I'll never get over it. I'll never be a good parent. I'll go, wait a second. The research shows that I know you're concerned about that, but if you can make sense of your childhood experiences and how they affected you, you can liberate yourself from perpetrating that which was done to you onto your kids. So that I wrote up in a book with my daughter's preschool director, Mary Hartzell, called Parenting from the Inside Out. And once I wrote that book, which starts with the science of attachment, and now we'll talk about the S's, I could write all the other 5 or 6 or whatever parenting books I've written, where I always say, start with parenting from the inside out, because that's what the research shows. Make sense of your own childhood experiences first, and then figure out, what do I do with my kids?
Yeah, ain't that the truth?
When that book was first coming out, one of my first teachers was Barry Brazelton, a pediatrician back a while ago. He passed away recently. And, when I said to Barry, when should we give this to parents? He said, right away, even when they're pregnant. And I'm not sure pregnancy is the best time, but definitely
before pregnancy.
Yeah, you want to read it. So that being said, as an educator and as a therapist for families, what I needed to do is take this entire field of attachment and make it really understandable, not just for the academics I was working with, but for parents. So basically, my summary of the entire field of attachment comes down to 4 S's. And here they are. When you get the first 3 S's, and if you don't get them, any of them, the parent recognizes there's a rupture, there's a disconnection, and readily and reliably makes a repair. So there's no such thing as perfect parenting. There's only showing up and being present as a parent with good intention and being aware, being mindful. So I say that because people freak out and go, oh my God, I haven't been doing it. If you haven't been doing it, fine. Now you can make a repair. It's never too late to make a repair. So that's the important place to start. And if you can, be kind to your inner experience, because we're all coming through a hard road.
Yeah.
And parenting is one of the hardest things to do in general, and these days especially. So the first S is the word seen, S-E-E-N. And when a child feels seen, it isn't just that you're using your eyes to see their behavior. It means you're using what I call a mind-sight lens to see their feelings, what has meaning for them, what was their intention, what were they remembering. The inner nature of their mental lives is what I mean by the word seen. And it's very clear from the research, parents who take the time and develop the skills, because they're learnable skills, to see the inner life of the child, have children who develop secure attachment.
Okay.
Second S, soothed. What this means is your child could be distressed. They've gone through what I call a window of tolerance. They're in chaos. They're in rigidity. They're shut down. Those moments, they're not in this kind of integrated flow. And at that moment, you yourself, because of a set of neurons in you called mirror neurons, which should have been called, I think, sponge neurons, you sponge in your kid's distress. So their distress may make you distressed. So if you don't have your presence there where you're receptive, you may become reactive even as they become reactive, which just amplifies all the reactivity. So soothing your child is more than, let me just, try to put a Band-Aid on their wound. It's really giving them the comfort that allows them to see that I, as your son, can be as distressed as I can be, and you don't leave me. You stay present with me. You're able to hold a space for my distress. And in that connection you establish, my nervous system, which is immature, is able to calm down, and that's what we mean by soothing. And don't forget, there's no such thing as perfect parenting. You may not see your child all the time. We don't soothe them all the time. But to be able to do that and say, wow, that pushed my hot button. I was having a hard time when you were screaming and yelling like that. Let me try to come back and soothe you. I'm so sorry I couldn't do it then. You can make a repair. And the third S, before the fourth of security, the third S is safe. So safe, of course, is keeping your child protected from injury, but it's also not being a source of emotional fear where, and I say this in all my books, there are times when, I would flip my lid and start screaming or say ridiculous things or whatever, and I would terrify my kids. I had to make a repair after that. Kids are meant to be kept safe by their attachment figures, their parents. And if we have unresolved trauma or unresolved loss, the research is very clear. We're more prone to doing things that we don't even want to do, that are unintentional, that terrify our kids. And even when we alter our own state because we're flipping out, that can be terrifying. If we get drunk, that can be terrifying. We're yelling at our spouse, that can be terrifying. And the other ones that are obvious, like abuse, neglect. So there's a wide range of what creates non-safety. And I don't mean a kid wants ice cream before dinner, you say no, and they go, you make me mad, no, you don't. This is not about just giving them everything they want. It's about not terrorizing them. Setting limits is extremely important for kids. When they have this and when they're not there, there's a repair made when there's a rupture in a reliable and relatively rapid way. Then a child develops security, which is this sense of wholeness, this sense of resilience, this sense of I can do this. And, we're still on a life of, do or die, in this world outside the womb. So no matter how great our parenting is, life is still hard. But security of attachment gives the best kind of resilience that we can give our kids. And the great news is that if you've had a really hard childhood yourself, dive into parenting from the inside out. Mary and I wrote that to be a big hug. And it's a guide to saying, how do I actually make sense of my life? Do that book. It's a workbook, basically. And the great news is, and this is, I was trained as a narrative scientist, when our narrative process literally makes sense in the two ways that we mean it. Makes sense meaning what's the logical way my childhood affected me, but makes sense as in I sense my body. I feel these things. You're able to integrate memory into things that were terrifying before, and you integrate it and you make sense of your life. And that's how you come to allow your personality to relax and stop being a prison and become more like a playground. It allows you to be more receptive with kind intention. So intention for sure that's kind. And that's how we want to bring our presence to our kids.
And I love that, Dan. I mean, you just set the stage for a second conversation at some point in the future, because I'd love to dive into parenting, but I think that's really helpful. You want to help your kids feel seen, soothed, safe. And when you can do that, they will also feel secure.
Absolutely.
I love that message that there's no such thing as perfect parenting. If you make a mistake, you can take responsibility and own up and apologize and repair. I think that's a really nice message. And then really broadening it out, really this idea that if you can make sense of your life history in the ways that you've described, yes, that helps you become a better parent, but frankly, it helps you become a better human being. You're going to be a better partner, a better friend, a better colleague. You're going to be less reactive and more receptive.
Absolutely. That's exactly it.
So Dan, for the person who heard us talk and who's interested in exploring more, yes, there's your brand new book, Personality and Wholeness in Therapy, integrating 9 patterns of developmental pathways in clinical practice. We've touched on some of the concepts. I know it's a lot deeper in that. Mm-hmm. But for someone who feels lost in life, who doesn't know where to go next, who feels that they're struggling, but senses some hope from our conversation today.
Yeah.
What words of advice would you give to them?
Words of advice. You know, there's a great quote from the wonderful poet and singer-songwriter Leonard Cohen that I took Alex Siegel, my son Alex, to see one of my heroes, which is also one of his heroes. And it was fortunately, obviously, before he passed away recently. And the lines go like this: ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's where the light gets in.
Dan, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you. It's been really wonderful to be here with you, Rangan. Really great.
If you enjoyed that conversation, then I think you are really going to enjoy this one.
The only challenge, I think, with addictions is that if you can't think greater than how you feel, your life will stay the same.
Yeah.
The solution then is